Hi, this is another in the second series on watercolor for Bible journaling. I'm practicing on dictionary pages because they're very similar in thickness and texture to the Bible pages we work on. This second video in the second series is to touch on some very broad, basic watercolor rules, so to speak. And the first of which I mentioned possibly in that first video, that if you have too much water on your brush, you're going to lack control. And if you don't have enough water on your brush, you get a very dry, scratchy appearance. We can use that to our advantage like we did here when we were testing our brushes. I can see using this as grass or maybe wood grain. You want to practice with your brushes to figure out what the correct amount of water is so that the paint flows smoothly, but that you can maintain the control. Another principle is watercolor painters try to maintain a white spot or a highlight in their painting, and watercolor purists again are going to try and have that white space actually be from the paper and not paint. So most watercolorists don't use white watercolor paint. The white tends to be a little more opaque, and a big reason we use watercolor is because it has a lovely translucent look to it. If you add white to lighten your watercolor color, it will make your paint more opaque. So I'm just going to make a little circle here. And I'm just going to try and leave this little area of white. If you're worried that you don't have the control to keep that area without paint running into it, you can use what's called a masking fluid. It comes in bottles that you can paint on, or it comes in a marker like this that you can just draw it on. It dries and then you paint over it. You let the paint dry and then you just take an eraser and rub this off, and then you know you have this clear white spot that the paint can't get under the masking fluid. The masking fluid in the bottles does tend to be a little hard on paintbrushes, so you don't want to use a new or really nice brush. So back to our white spot here. I've been letting it dry a little bit. If the light is hitting from this side, creating the white spot, then I'm going to have to do my shading or darker color on the underside or the opposite side of where the light is. So I'm just going to kind of lay down some color there. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of why you would have a white spot. Now on a flower, not every petal is going to have a white spot left, but you are going to want to look at the overall flower and decide where you would leave some white space. So since I put this on here, and I'm actually going to go ahead and blend this out just a little bit, because it's a very harsh line. And in watercolor, we really don't want to see sharp, harsh lines, unless, of course, you're doing something like grass. And here's where I talked about in the first video that watercolor purists love their watercolor paper, and it's because of this that it makes it a little more difficult to work on the Bible pages. Do you see how I'm getting some darker lines? That's because this paper, when it gets wet, it wrinkles in a hill and valley sort of way, and you may have to kind of push that color around so that you don't have lines as it dries. So now I'm going to talk about the two ways that we blend out color in watercolor. The first way is a wet on wet technique, which we talked about wet on wet and wet on dry in the first series of videos where I taught on washes and backgrounds. Right now I'm just laying down some water in the shape of a petal, like a flower petal. The next thing I'm going to do is get a heavy amount of pigment on my brush, and I'm just going to lay it down along one edge and let the color run into the water. Then I'm going to wash off my brush, and I'll come back in and blend out that edge. And I'll just pull that color towards the center of the petal. So you can definitely see we've got this darker edge and then highlights created just by adding more water and making the color more translucent. I can always go back in and add more of the darker color, or I can let it dry and I can add more color on top as another layer. So that's the other way you can blend color in watercolor, and it's probably the more common way for those watercolor purists, is they're going to take and lay down a very, very faint color. So this is a wet on dry technique. My paint is wet, my page is dry. I'm going to lay down another petal. Then I'm going to let that dry completely. And by the magic of videography, you didn't have to wait for that to dry. Now I'm going to come in with a slightly darker color, and I'm just going to fill in another about 2/3 of this with the darker color. Then I'm going to wash my brush and get it wet completely. And I'm just going to blend that edge so that it's not a little bit too much water on there. See, I'm still learning. I'm just going to blend this edge a little bit so that it's not a harsh edge. Okay, and then we're going to let that dry completely. And then last but not least, I'm going to come in with my darkest color and just do this edge. Then I'm going to wash my brush out again. And remember, in our first video, I talked about how we have 2 cups of water, one to rinse the paint off and then one to put clean water on our brush before we go back into the paint, or to have clean water on our brush to blend out the edges. So I've got just water on my brush, although my brush is staining from the paint. It's not got any paint on it. And then I'm dabbed it a little bit on a paper towel so I wouldn't have too much water and lose my control. And then I'm just going to blend out that edge. Just where I want it. And then I'm going to let that dry completely. So you can see we used 2 very different techniques, and they gave us somewhat similar look, but a little bit different look. This one, the paint flowed on its own a little more. This one, I controlled the color a little more to my preference. And because watercolor is translucent, when you layer other colors over the top of it, it just intensifies and builds on your base colors. And in a lot of other colors where they're maybe not so similar, you can actually see those bottom layers through the layers that have been spread over the top of them. So when you're layering color, you want to make sure that each layer dries completely before you add the next. Now let's look at how we can use our liftoff technique, which we looked at a little bit in one of the background wash videos, where we put water drops on the page and then we lifted the water after it sat there for a little bit, and you got these little white bleached out spots from where the water was sitting. So you can use that for a couple of other things. If you get too much color in one spot, you can use a paper towel or a dry brush to lift some of the color off. My page is treated on this side with matte gel medium, and it's not treated on this side. And I rarely treat my pages when I'm doing watercolor in my Bible. So I'm just going to do a flat wash here really quickly on both the treated side of the page and the untreated side of the page. And you can see right away that it does flow a little bit differently. I just wanted to first show you that if you did make a mistake or have too much color or wanted to create a highlight, you can actually use a dry brush to lift up some of the color, just like that. Or on this side. The other thing I can do is I can take my paper towel and I can dab my paper to lift, and I get kind of a textured look. This is kind of fun for making clouds. Now let's talk a little bit about how watercolor paint flows. Watercolor tends to flow to drier but still damp surfaces. If I have a dry surface and I put water on it, and then I drop my paint in, my paint is only going to stay where I put water. It'll move and flow in that area, but it won't leave the boundaries of where I had water laid down. Now watch what happens if I put water next to this. Do you see how the paint just bled over to the new area of water? If I were laying down another color, those two colors would then be blended, and you wouldn't have two pure colors sitting next to each other. So it works for blending when you're trying to lighten out like we did in the petals just a few minutes ago, but when you really want two slightly different colored petals next to each other, or two geometric shapes next to each other, and you don't want the colors running together, then you need to let the first one dry completely. So say I let this dry. How am I sure it's completely dry? One of the things you can do is, if it looks dry, you can touch it with your finger, and if it still feels cold, then it's probably still damp. Now let's see what happens when I lay color down on dry paper next to the damp color. And I'm going right along beside and trying not to get the paint actually on top of the other. And then we're going to give it a minute here to watch how it reacts. Okay, I've given it some time, and you can hopefully see, I'll try and get close here on the camera and not have too much glare. But you can see how the blue is running into the more red color, because this is still damp and this is wet. So again, paint always flows to a drier but still damp area from a wetter area. Now let's see when we put two next to each other and we actually give it the appropriate drying time. And I can actually do that right here since this is completely dry. I can go right up against that edge and it's not going to bleed over either way. Or I can go right over the top and give myself that translucent layering look. And it's not going to blend. It's more like having a yellow piece of glass over a blue piece of glass, and it's going to look green